And welcome to our lecture over Incan art. So you've had numerous assigned resources over the Inca Empire, several readings, several videos, so please note that that's an important part of your notes and covers important information that I won't necessarily be going into detail here since it's already been covered. I've seen it spelled both ways, Inca with a K and with a C. I'm more familiar with the K, so I have a tendency to use that. So this is an extensive empire from Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and even parts of Chile. And so in order to essentially control such a massive empire, or the fact that it was such a massive empire, attests to the hierarchy, attests to the efficiency of their road system to help transfer these ideas and to help emphasize the control of this massive system. There were over 20,000 miles of roads here with this extensive network. You've watched a video about their extremely skilled metallurgy skills, so just please keep that in mind. We won't be covering that as much during this lecture series, or during this lecture. And also what's incredible is how they did not develop a writing system. You watched a video about their record keeping with the rope work, so please note that. And let's begin. So the city of Cusco, as you read, is shaped like a puma, which is an important animal, a symbol of power. Throughout Mesoamerica and Central America and South America, these large cats are power symbols. We didn't so much cover that with the Aztecs, but the jaguar was particularly an important symbol. The ancient Maya, the jaguar was an important symbol. So we see that here again with this idea of the city being laid out like a puma, symbolizing this royal power. And so let's talk about the main temple, which no longer exists. So similar to our Aztecs, once they were conquered by the Spaniards, that they destroyed most of the indigenous artworks and records and structures, melted down the metal. And so it's the same thing here, where we have the destruction of the main temple, unfortunately, and where there was a church and monastery of Santo Domingo built atop it. So, and we see the mix of this. We see the original masonry here, okay, versus the later Spanish masonry, unfortunately. So here we have another view, and you can clearly tell the difference between the different structures. Another view. So ashlar masonry is a type of stone masonry where you fit together these finely dressed stones of these different shapes and sizes in this case, and they're laid together without any type of mortar, so without cement. Think of a brick building where you have that mortar in between each brick to hold it all together. Where here they fit together almost like a Lego piece. They're so perfectly shaped together. And we've essentially lost the means by which they created these stones. I mean, they're just so perfectly shaped together. Now this area is prone to seismic movement, and so the shape of these stones also help to somehow create space as well to where they aren't going to be knocked over. Okay, so the original temple was similar to the idea of this central location that we saw with the Aztecs, of almost this axis mundi to an extent, where it was placed at the convergence of the four main highways that connected these four different districts of the empire. And so the temple cemented the symbolic importance of the religion, of the dominant power, and in a way unites these different cultural practices across this vast territory. This was a temple that was dedicated to the sun. The Spaniards describe how the floors and all the walls were just covered in gold. So we're not sure if that's accurate, but this idea of the gold and the reflection when the sun hits it helps to reinforce this idea of the sun. It's symbolic of the sun. Now the original building tapered upward, almost like this trapezoid type building. And yeah, so just such a loss. Anyway, so this is a common practice across the globe, across time, even ancient Mesopotamia, the beginning of civilization, where one power would conquer another, and they would place their own buildings directly atop the previous power buildings as a symbol of this new power. So here's that ashlar masonry again. So maize cobs. So the maize is an important a staple of the diet of most of the people of the Americas, Northern, Central, Southern America. We know that in America, think to Thanksgiving, and the whole reason for it was that the Indigenous Americans had given us the means to be able to, or had given Europeans the means to grow corn. It served as a staple for their diet. And so here we have these maize cobs. In these maize cobs, there would have been many. Sheet metal and repoussé metal alloys and silver. I'm not sure, sorry. I guess I didn't copy that over. These were placed throughout the garden in front of this main temple that we talked about. This is one of only 3 of these small sculptures that still exist. Most of the rest were unfortunately melted down. But reports by one of the early explorers, Pizarro, describes this whole garden planted with this gold and this silver maize here. And so it's this idea of, especially outside of a religious structure, is you need to be able to be worshiping your deities correctly and doing what you're supposed to do for your religion in order for your agriculture to thrive, for the next harvest to come, etc. And so it's believed that these were intended to be meant to ensure a successful harvest, essentially. They were agricultural gardens representing the agriculture of the empire. And so this repoussé technique that they were talked about is where these sculptures were fashioned out of sheet metal, like placed upon like how do I explain it? Like something that was already like a harder material that was shaped like corn, and then you would place the sheet metal on top of it and hammer it to be able to form to the shape of the corn that we see here. And yeah, so it would have been used for these ritualistic purposes, and the silver here would oxidize over time. And so that oxidized silver creates this purplish color. And when you consider originally the many, many different colors and shades of different forms of maize, this makes sense that it especially emulates the purple type maize that we see here. The black maize was particularly common in Peru, and so that oxidized silver makes sense. It would have been a whole ritual process of creating them, because again, they were placed within such an important location. And here we are. Okay, so the walls at Sacsayhuaman, I've seen it described several different ways, but essentially here's another great example of our ashlar masonry and how this was a fortified structure outside of Cusco. It was this complex. It's at the head of that puma-shaped plan of the city. The walls were built after 1438. Before the Spaniards came, this was one of the newest civilizations, but at the time it was a century old, but it was one of the largest. It was the largest in the entire world. And so there's warfare with any major power. There's going to be other powers trying to take over, and you have Cusco that's the capital over these other peoples, and so there was obvious evidence, and warfare was necessary for this type of control. And so we have this fortified area outside of Cusco. We had this zigzag wall, and again another example of what remains of the original ashlar masonry. So, there's believed to be about 20,000 people worked on this fortified area over a 50-year period. Not much remains. Okay, so let's talk about the city of Machu Picchu. So you read about this, you watched a video about this. And one of the draws to it was that it had been forgotten. The Spanish didn't quite ransack it, at least we're not sure. But it had forgotten until 1911. It was pretty much undisturbed by the outside world. Unless you're up there at the top, it looks like part of the natural mountain range. You can't really tell that it's about 1,200 people had lived here. Now, this complex has remnants of baths, of houses, of palaces, of temples, of agricultural areas. But it's believed that it was more of a vacation spot, if you will, that there were people, more like servants, who lived here for the upkeep, but that it was more of a retreat for like the royal family or the elite and their servants. So it was difficult to get to. Imagine the process of getting outside materials, etc., to this location. Like the rest of the empire, it was mostly, it was pulled by donkeys and by foot, etc., these materials. So it was built of stone. It's in this perfectly precise shapes that are grooved together. The roofs would have been of thatched roofs, so that's why they haven't lasted. And the houses are basic trapezoidal shape. People farmed on the terraces. Imagine these are these types of terraces. But what's remarkable about this site is the celestial remnants here, the observatories that are left here. And so one such is this stone. And so it means hitching posts to the sun. And so along the spring and autumn equinox, or it lines up with the spring and autumn equinoxes, so it hitches to the sun. So midday on March 21st and September 21st, the sun is directly overhead. It doesn't cast any shadow. So it's seen as like tied or hitched to the sun. And that's possible because it's at this awkward 13-degree angle. Just the precision that attests to the depth of the astronomical knowledge of the Inca. There are numerous other structures here that line up with certain times of these celestial movements. We have an observatory. And so the Inca were extremely knowledgeable of celestial events and had studied the skies. Machu Picchu. Okay, so let's talk about the Altuapaque tunic and appreciate the artwork of this piece. Is that you may see a piece of textile and not necessarily think that it's an extraordinary piece of art, but imagine the craftsmanship going into each of these tiny, tiny details. So here we are. So the textiles for the Inca were considered extremely valuable, that they're an example of the wealth of this empire. And these tunics were particularly the most valuable. The name refers to these small rectangular designs. In this one in particular, they were used exclusively by the kings. So there's different theories about the designs. Many of the motifs are believed to represent different clans. It may be a symbol of the ruler's reign, as well as the unity of the empire, with all these different types of motifs coming together on a single piece of textile. Either way, most scholars agree that they have a political meaning, or that they take memberships in different social groups, etc., or the king's control. And so the Inca would use these for certain occasions, or other versions would be worn normally. But the ones for the kings were made by these sacred female weavers. So the Kalas were these chosen women. They were described as virgins of the sun. And essentially they were sequestered in almost like this convent type experience where they were seen as these sacred weavers, where these were so valuable and these were so important that the weavers had to be away from society and trained within the ways to make this. And the red dye is particularly expensive. It's made out of these small insects, similar to Like when you think of the color purple, especially in the ancient world, with purple being designated with kings, it's because they were made out of these small little insects to produce this dye. So similar to where it's difficult for us to understand the idea of dyes being expensive and hard to create. But back in the day, this was the case where it was very difficult to make this dye. So the red attests to the value of this artwork. And the more elaborate and greater the number of designs indicates the higher social status of the person who wore this. And there wraps up our Inca Empire.